Well, let's assume that she at least had some say in what her sitting room or dining room looked like anyway. Where would she have got the ideas for the decoration?
Well, to look firstly at the wall decoration, which is a series of highly coloured, highly decorative panels. This, of course, is one of the main features of a Roman room, the high level of colour and the mixture of colours. She would get that information from pattern books, from local craftsmen who would be working in this material and who would be able to show her the sort of range of opportunities. And that's well established in the evidence from the classical world, of course. In this town, we've been very lucky because one of the effects of the abandonment of some of the buildings that we've been excavating in recent years is that materials such as plaster from the wall and the ceiling can in fact fall in large sections. So you can, with great care and conservation, not only rebuild but reconstruct the overall room pattern.
And the effect is very striking, although I like the geometric designs on the walls and ceiling more than the choice of colour scheme. The combination of purple, terracotta, yellow, red, blue and green is all very cheerful, but perhaps a bit overpowering for today's tastes. Our Roman lady seems to have had quite a pampered life. Slaves looked after the house and the children. So how did she while away the hours? Well, there was always gossip to be had down at the forum, or an afternoon at the baths, and I'll bet that new clothes and textiles were a regular topic of conversation. The fine silk from China that was literally worth its weight in gold must have caused an envious flutter of interest, like an exclusive Paris design today. John Peter Wilde of Manchester University is a textile specialist, and I learned from him that though the Romans had the edge in the import-export business, they knew nothing about the manufacture of cloth that the Celts didn't already know.
The first textiles we have are pretty sophisticated, extremely good quality. Plain weaves, wools, linens, things of this sort. Things that would be virtually indistinguishable nowadays from the garments we have on our backs right now.
What about the looms that they were using?
Well, they were quite large, or they could be quite large, sort of 6 or 7 feet square, large frames on which you could weave something as big as a travelling rug all in one piece, which was, of course, a great advantage. But equally well, they had very tiny looms. You could do very intricate work for embroidery and things of this sort.
And who would have been making it? Would each community have its specialised weaver, or would people just do it in their own homes?
I think probably both. There would be specialists, people who were particularly good at weaving would spend most of their time doing it. There would be housewives filling in the hours, weaving in their back kitchens for the family. I think that was certainly the major pattern.
And what did the clothes look like, do you know?
Well, for the Iron Age, they were fairly close-fitting. Men wore trousers and women wore fairly close-fitting bodices with lots of jewellery and brooches and things of this sort. But when the Romans arrived, things changed a little bit. The overall impression one gets of the main Roman garment is of a great sack draped round the body, great loose flapping thing, which eventually becomes what we call the dalmatic in church vestments nowadays. Look very similar. And so there is a considerable difference in fashion style between the Roman period and what went before in Britain.
Sounds as though the indigenous ones were rather better suited to the climate then.
In a way they were, because certainly the Eastern versions of the same kind of close-fitting garment come back in the later Roman period and become very fashionable. So they come in, as it were, by the back door.
So the Romans didn't adopt what the British were wearing when they first arrived, thinking, well, that's sensible, I'll try that.
Well, Romans were quite prepared to pick up any good ideas that anybody had floating around. And it's very difficult to define what is actually Roman fashion, Italian Roman fashion anyway.
Did they take to wearing trousers?
Well, Roman soldiers wore leather breeches, good sensible things, but somehow they didn't seem to regard those as strange, whereas they certainly had regarded Celtic loose-fitting trousers as definitely barbarian and beyond the pale.
Was there a fashion to imitate the Romans?
Within limits, I think, yes, because, of course, Romans theoretically at least wore togas, though, as every schoolboy knows, they didn't actually, because they were great clumsy things that Romans themselves bitterly resented having to wear on special occasions. So I think the number of occasions you'd find the Romans wearing a toga in Britain was negligible.
What about the jewellery that was used to put it all together, hold it all together?
Yes, most Roman jewellery is functional, in the sense it isn't something you hang on you for ornament. It has a precise function in regard to the clothing. For late Iron Age fashion, the women wore 2 brooches, one on each shoulder, a matching pair, and then sometimes a third, holding the outer garment pinning it through onto the shirt-like undergarment. And this combination of brooches one gets quite often in grave finds.
So you're talking about a tunic that doesn't actually have straps all the way over the shoulder.
Right.
It sort of joins up at the top and is clasped.
That's so, yes. In effect, the woman wore 3 basic garments. She wore a close-fitting vest with long sleeves. Over that and pinned to it, a loose-fitting tube-like bodice,
Like a
And
sort of
over
gym
that-
slip.
That's right. It would look very much like a gym slip. And over that, a separate rectangular cloak, which sometimes was pinned as well.
And would they sleep in the undergarment?
They slept in nothing at all. We've got pictures to prove it.
How do you mean you have pictures?
Well,
of
you've
people?
got pictures of people's gravestones. And the lady is getting up in the morning, she's throwing her bedclothes off, and she's got a servant there with her outdoor garments ready to slip them on over her head. No doubt about it at all.
They may have had no use for nighties, but they certainly used household textiles as we do today. Curtains, cushions, sheets, bed covers. And as the Corinium room in Cirencester shows, they were very brave about using colour. Most surviving textile fragments are a misleading shade of mud brown. But George Taylor, who's been working on the Viking excavations at York, uses chemical analysis to establish which dye was originally present in the fabric.
Well, right from very early times, perhaps 3000 BC, I think, is perhaps the earliest documented time, there was available a complete spectrum of colours. They had the primary colours, blue, red and yellow, and those dyes were available for many thousands of years, and by mixing those colours, of course, you could get any colour you wanted. There were available to Northern Europeans a number of standard dyes that could have been grown locally or might have been imports. Apart from that, the Iron Age housewife was incredibly ingenious. She had time on her side after all, and she had lots of plants growing, well, I was going to say in the back garden, but that's probably didn't have gardens in those days, perhaps in the forest, including lichens, and it's very easy to stain wool, quite a range of colours, and very early on, human beings being what they are, they would have invented processes for colouring their garments. People do like colour. The ancient authors do quote, for example, Pliny talks about Caesar going to Gaul and seeing the Gauls in their baggy trousers, and these baggy trousers were checked, and they were striped, and red was a very prominent colour. And they had blue cloaks and black cloaks, so they must have been a very colourful mob indeed. So in other words, the range of colours that were available was wide and quite sophisticated, and moreover they were relatively easy to apply.
So to return to our Celtic house, we can now begin to sketch it in our minds with colourful wall hangings and colourful people. What about the furniture, though, the fixtures and fittings of the Iron Age house? Peter Reynolds.
From the English evidence, we got very little to go on at all. But if we go to the continent, we know full well that they had beds, and they had chairs, and they had folding chairs, and they had a thing like a chaise longue they discovered recently in Germany, a magnificent burial, in which there was clearly a chaise longue upon which your man was actually laid to rest. And this thing had wheeled legs, little wheels on the bottom of the legs, absolutely marvellous. Now, I think that we can be more or less sure that they had a sophisticated range of furniture, and certainly given the tools that they had and their craftsmanship in wood, you see, the only thing they didn't have, I suppose, is a Black & Decker drill. They had every other tool you can think of in the carpenter's tool kit, and the joinery that we get samples of is absolutely marvellous. There's no joint that they didn't really use. They had dovetail joints, mortise and tenon joints, so ordinary manufacture of furniture is not a problem. The only problem we have is that we haven't found any of it. So we're talking really about specifics that haven't yet emerged in this country, but trace evidence of it comes from Europe in general, and most of it is magnificent.
So what the Romans brought in terms of furnishings was not any greater degree of comfort, it was just according to their taste rather than the British taste.
I think this would be true. I think it's quite wrong to think the Romans actually liberated the native savage from his evil ways. This is a piece of propaganda put out by the Romanists, and really isn't substantiated by the evidence whatsoever. The fact that they built square houses of stone and of brick rather than timber and wattle and daub just means that we found more of them. The fact that they had very cold tiled floors with mosaic patterns therein, and these have survived and have been of enormous interest simply because they're old, has distorted our view of prehistory in general and the Iron Age in particular.
What would have been on the floor in here?
In all probability, they would have had rugs and mats. The floor would have been covered, and where it wasn't covered, you've got a perfectly adequate dirt floor. And if you wanted to, you could put down dung on the floor. I know this sounds decidedly unattractive, but you can actually polish dung when it's dry, so it's just like a polished parquet floor. No problems at all.
Well, it's cheap anyway, and if it doesn't work out, you can always spread it round the vegetables. But let's return to the Romans and Corinium's pièce de résistance, the only genuine article in the whole room, the mosaic floor.
Yes, it's the Four Seasons mosaic found in Cirencester in 1849. Very early example of mosaic work recovered in the town. Very typical piece of work locally, made from local material, local limestone and sandstone. Again, to a pattern book design, that's well established in the mosaic world.
So the Roman lady or the husband or whoever chose it would have said, right, in our triclinium we're going to have the design on 34B.
Yes. Well, that's the effect, yes, certainly. But the husband and wife together made that decision for a number of reasons. Firstly, the decorative effect, the end result, is highly decorative. But also, and equally important, I suspect, because there are a number of themes running through this. It's not only a floor. It does tell you something about the pretensions of the family. The 4 roundels in each of the corners of what is a 9-roundel grid. Those 4 roundels are the 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn and winter. Well, that is a relationship to the countryside. It perhaps might suggest to us that this was a common theme. It might suggest that the owner had some property outside of the town. Maybe he was a landowner. Maybe there's some connection with farming activity. The 4 seasons, the changing of the year.
Aren't you inferring too much from their choice of mosaic? I mean, I'd choose a mosaic floor because I like the pattern, not because I was trying to make a social statement.
Well, I'm being a bit cheeky, I know, but I think there is something about it because the whole point of the design of your floor is that this is a focal point in your building. We don't have a modern parallel as far as interior design is concerned. Perhaps it's frivolous, but maybe the second car garage is the sort of modern version. But I wonder whether, you've got studies of Greek mythology here. It's a talking point, isn't it, to your friends? It suggests that you were able to talk with some authority about the subject. It certainly reflected the wealth of the family, and I think other things follow from that.
A very status-conscious people, the Romans. Their mass production, standardized methods and predictability are certainly helpful to David Viner as an archaeologist. But if you were given the choice of travelling back into one culture or the other, where would you feel spiritually more at home? I have a hunch that, as a woman, I'd opt for the Celts. They did have 2 queens, after all, Boudica and Cartimandua. And to my mind, not even the convenience of pavements, central heating and hot baths could really make up for the sheer boredom of being a Roman colonial lady who got shut out of the dining room when the fun was going on. But the Celtic style of entertainment may not be to your taste. I'll leave you with Peter Reynolds and the robust Celts to help you make up your mind.
We've got one description of a feast, for example, from the classical writers, where we are told the warriors sat round in a great circle with a fire in the middle and the cooking area, with slaves providing the necessary foods, and one can imagine them eating roast wild boar, not to mention all the splendid veggies and types of bread that they could bake. We have all this food, and then they say an entertainment was laid on. Either a chap came on like a bard and sang songs of heroic deeds, or alternatively they had wrestling matches. The writer goes on to say that the people watching the wrestling matches often got so carried away they would draw their own knives and indulge in their own battles. Presumably they were a betting nation.